I've now realised, having sat through the first 4 or 5 presentations, that there is actually a conspiracy today, and we as the sort of respondents to the regulatory reform agenda have come after those that are actually implementing the regulatory reform and have had all of the best sound bites around both how well it's going and potentially how not so well it's going. I really wanted to just spend a couple of minutes moving the debate on a little, I guess, specifically around some of the practical ramifications of where we are in the regulatory reform agenda as of now. And that is, a lot of good work has been done. And I mean that very genuinely, and I think everyone from the industry should congratulate the legislators on the enormous amount of work they've done since 2008 in addressing what were obviously structural issues in the financial services sector. And it's clear there's further work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done around equivalence and ensuring that we don't inadvertently create imbalances between what is expected and required in certain jurisdictions versus what may ultimately be required across the European Union. And I very deliberately said certain jurisdictions in that I don't think the debate should be limited to or entirely focused on what's currently happening in Dodd-Frank and the US. And David, I think in his opening remarks, alluded to the importance of the global regulatory framework and what comes next. We're really only seeing currently 2 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle coming together. That's North America and Europe, and 2 obviously very important pieces, and we heard a little bit about how important those 2 economies are in the global context in one of the earlier presentations. What we don't know yet, of course, is what Asia will do, although I think there are some early signs coming out from Asia as to how they're going to respond to that. And the key, I think, is in terms of the US and Europe working together, I think we have a golden opportunity to demonstrate to the world that we can create an effective mechanism for supervision and overseeing markets which operate at a global level. And that's not really the securities markets. And Robert, my apologies if I sort of try to take us away from the securities markets. The global markets are really focused on derivatives and, incredibly importantly, the global transference of risk in commodity pricing. And I think this is being overlooked generally in the regulatory reform agenda. If we go back to what the G20 asked for, the G20 was concerned about stresses that have emerged in the financial institutions and the financial side of the economy. Particularly in Europe, what we're currently doing in regulatory reform extends beyond that prudential area of how do we ensure our financial institutions are secure and safe. There are tertiary impacts from EMIR, for example, which apply directly to the corporate sector, and this is largely around increasing prudential risk through margin requirements. And my apologies, it's hard to give this presentation without beginning to sound a little arcane and detailed. But the emerging standards for on-exchange derivatives, which operated successfully throughout the crisis, are being affected by the desire to drive higher prudential standards into the financial sector. That risk transference that goes on through the corporate side of the markets that we serve is fundamentally important to the broader agenda of how do we get all of our economies growing again. And to the extent that we're increasing prudential standards, we're going to take capital out of non-financial institutions, such as Lufthansa or Rolls-Royce or Siemens, the users of either interest rate products, which give them the ability to take interest rate risk out of their business, or fundamental consumption needs that they have in commodities, base metals, and the such like. To the extent that the new prudential standards bring that capital into central counterparties, we may be reducing certain aspects of financial risk, we're tying that capital up in a form where it can't be deployed for other purposes in the economy more generally. And I think we need to look very carefully at the detail of the new requirements to ensure that we find the right balance between improved prudential standards in relation to financial institutions, but not altering fundamentally how the corporate side of the industry accesses and uses many products which were created specifically for the transference of corporate risk to other institutions that have the balance sheet available to carry those risks on their behalf. So really there are two themes I would like to leave with you. One is, to be frank, the devil is in the detail. Much of this detail isn't in level 1 legislation. I think if you look at the level 1 legislation, generally it is largely convergent, and if you consider that it's the output of a political process, it's more convergent than you might otherwise expect. And clearly there are two entirely different legislative processes going on, creating new regulation in the US and a new regulation in Europe. So I think we should be, in many ways, surprised by the degree of convergence. Where I think the issues are starting to emerge are actually at level 2, and specifically in Europe, as level 2 is being evolved and developed, we're seeing that there are significant variants in approach. And I think an earlier speaker made clear that I don't think that should be unexpected. The issue really is about timing. If Europe believes that we need to implement higher standards than are currently prevalent, then we need to ensure that we do that in lockstep at a global level, not simply within the European area alone. So that's one area. The devil's in the detail, and I'd like to leave that in your minds, and maybe we can talk a little bit of that when we get to questions at the panel. The other is just to reinforce the rest of the world is looking on. To the extent there are disagreements going on between Europe and the US in terms of what the global picture should look like in terms of supervision and prudential standards for the markets that operate in our jurisdictions. Particularly Asia is looking at those differences of opinion, and if we can't achieve commonality effectively, I think the likely outcome is Asia will take its own path. Now, what path it will take, any number of you will probably be better informed or better able to guess what path it's going to take. But what it won't do is converge. And if we want a global marketplace in financial services, it is essential that it converges. On that point, I'd like to leave you and hand over to the next speaker.